Hi, I'm Ari Redbord. Welcome to TRM Talks. TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. Over the last few years, North Korea has been attacking the cryptocurrency ecosystem at alarming speed and scale, stealing billions from crypto businesses to fund weapons proliferation and other destabilizing activity. And we have seen a global response. Today, I sit down with a team of experts: Deputy Assistant Secretary Jung H of the U.S. State Department, John Park, Director of the Korea Project and Harvard's Belfer Center, and Nick Carlsen of TRM Labs to discuss the risk posed by North Korea and how to neutralize it. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. Before we dig in, this is really an extraordinary panel of experts from really all different sort of walks of the issue, from obviously from State Department, from former law enforcement, from sort of academia. Jung, would you sort of kick us off? Would love to kind of hear about your journey. It's a super interesting one before we really kind of dig into the topic.
Ari, thanks for having me on, and great to see John Park and Nick Carlsen as always. Nothing in my resume says anything about DPRK or crypto or cyber heists. I'm a huge liberal arts fan. I went to grad school to get a PhD in U.S. history. I was going to be a history professor of the U.S. civil rights movement and the Civil War and Reconstruction. And then after my PhD, I taught for a little bit in New York City, and then went into the CIA to work on DPRK issues. And then I was at Brookings for 3 years doing research on the Korean Peninsula, and ultimately entered with the Biden-Harris administration in January of 2021, and have been working on the DPRK issue along with other East Asia Pacific related issues since then. But really great to be with all of you today to talk about this issue.
Thank you so much. Yeah, really excited to kind of dig into the work you're doing at State now, and maybe get into a little of that ancient history on there as well. John, would love to hear your story.
Sure. It's really a story of three sectors. It started off in academia and looking at the 1994 North Korean nuclear crisis. At a time when many people thought that North Korea would go away. This was in the late 90s. And so it was almost a history type of approach. And the history lens, as Dr. Pak has mentioned as well, it's a powerful lens, but definitely that time period was very, very different. The puzzle that emerged is that North Korea and the North Korean regime continues to defy the estimates. They find ways to adapt and modify. The second part of the career was working in finance. In Korea, and there's an element of public-private partnership, but always some sort of crisis in the background, and being able to observe it from the lens of the marketplace. And then the third aspect of the career was working in DC think tank and putting it all kind of together before coming back to academia. But looking at how the North Korean regime evades sanctions through the marketplace, the accumulated learning, the innovation that goes on. That's been a big focus of tracking what we call North Korea Incorporated, and how North Korea Incorporated just got virtual.
Fantastic. That's a great place to go to, Nick, for your story in terms of sort of the investigative aspects of this. Just give us a little bit of your background. Be awesome.
Yeah, no, my story in North Korea basically started out of my control. I joined the army, and I thought I was going to learn Russian, but I actually was assigned Korean. I was very upset about that, and ended up doing nothing but North Korea for the last 20 years. First in the army, later at the FBI, and that's where obviously I met you, Ari, but worked on a bunch of North Korean money laundering investigations, stuff like the Hongshan investigation, which was premised on Dr. Park's paper. That's actually what kicked us off on that. So it goes all the way back.
Fantastic, and excited to kind of dig into sort of the investigative aspects and sort of what we're seeing in terms of typologies and trends from North Korea. But Jung, would love to kind of start with you and talk a little bit about your work at the State Department in particular. Sort of what are the efforts coming out of State, and even more broadly from the interagency on the sort of North Korea threat, and maybe even sort of that cyber crypto element more granularly.
Yeah. I want to step back a little bit before we dig into the cyber and the crypto and talk about how in general, the DPRK has been. Let me tell you about what we're seeing now, what we saw then, and what I think we're going to see, which is that the DPRK uses a lot of revenue generation efforts and we've used UN security sanctions and US sanctions to try to stem those revenue earnings. We see cyber and crypto as a growth industry for them, which means it's a growth industry for us. And we're not taking this lying down. So as the sanctions are working in terms of stemming their efforts to get money from overseas labor, whether it's construction or agriculture or medicine, and as well as illicit activities, that cyber is a new frontier for the DPRK. And I think during the pandemic, as the attack surface has increased exponentially, the DPRK has also adapted and grown more sophisticated in growing their capabilities to generate revenue for their regime. Since 2020, beginning of 2022, what we've seen so far is almost 90 ballistic missile tests. They threatened tactical nuclear weapons use. They've claimed new capabilities, such as claimed hypersonic glide vehicle capabilities. They're doing more drills. They're talking about underwater or UUVs, and talking about new platforms, diversifying their platforms, as well as increasing the sophistication of their ballistic missiles. And so, combined with all of these actual activities and the testing, and their increasingly threatening rhetoric, we see cyber and crypto heists and their use of IT workers overseas as a way that reinforces those unlawful WMD programs. And so we've been very much engaged with industry, with our interagency, to try to stem those efforts. To give you a scale of this, the UN panel of experts and multiple industry reports have reported that the DPRK stole anywhere from $1 billion to $2.3 billion between 2017 and 2022. And in 2022 alone, the United States government attributed theft of over $720 million in cryptocurrency to the DPRK. Separate from the cyber thefts, we're very concerned about the DPRK IT workers, who are fast becoming a significant source of illicit revenue for the regime. They raise revenue for the regime by gaining employment using fraudulent identities and working as freelance IT workers for companies and organizations that unknowingly hire them. This is not just a US DPRK problem. This is not just a ROC or Japan, Republic of Korea or Japan problem. This is a global issue from our perspective, given that these IT workers are based in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and cyber is inherently transnational and across borders. So, to address this threat, we're going after the money, but we're also sharing closely with foreign partners. That was the symposium that we had in San Francisco that brought in industry, several dozen foreign governments, as well as U.S. interagency and Korean government officials, to talk about this threat, to share information, and to serve as resources for each other. But also, for us from the U.S. government, we have a pretty deep bench of experts, as you all know, who can help the world and industry on these issues. And this reminds me a lot of COVID, right? We are as strong as our weakest communities. And so we believe that it's in our interests and it's in all of our friends and partners' interests to be working together on this threat, which is not just a national security threat, but it's an economic and governance threat for not just us, but for all of the countries involved.
That is awesome, and so much to unpack there. And I'm going to ask these guys to actually maybe jump on a couple of the points you raised. But one thing that struck me is I'm not sure a lot of folks really understand sort of the interagency, sort of, which is the U.S. government sort of writ large, and the way different departments work together. And one thing, when I was at Treasury, I saw this sort of, live and in person. But I love the way you sort of articulated the state's role, right? Treasury, you have that sort of illicit finance sanctions piece. DOJ is very much what Nick was focused on, sort of those individual criminal prosecutions. And then state really plays this sort of key diplomatic role where you're bringing together partners sort of and in public and private sector to sort of address the threat together. I mean, is that a fair sort of assessment there?
Yeah. So when we talk about the U.S. government, if we disaggregate all of that area, you did it perfectly, right? State Department, it's not just me in the East Asia Pacific Bureau. We have colleagues at the International Security and Nonproliferation Bureau. We have colleagues in the Economics Bureau who work across the United States government to work on these issues. And cyber, DPRK, IT, and overseas workers, the ballistic missile program and the nuclear weapons program, our economic health and vitality and protecting our industries. Those are all cross-cutting issues, and we need absolutely to be talking to each other and sharing information with each other. I'll have to say that when we had the co-hosted U.S. Korea cyber symposium in San Francisco last week, perhaps some of your members of your audience were participated in that. We had FBI, DOJ, the intelligence community. We had other law enforcement. We had State Department from across the department, as well as the Korean government also had their various government entities too. So this is really a breathtaking, coordinated and a coordinated effort that requires a lot of collaboration, and I think we do that pretty well on this issue set.
Terrific. Thank you so much. John, this one's for you, but Nick, I want you to keep your powder dry on a couple of things. IT workers, I really want to kind of dig into that a little bit more, and also sort of obviously the crypto heist investigations piece. But John, sort of maybe stepping back a little bit here, I was in Japan, I don't know, maybe a month or so ago for the FATF virtual asset contact meeting, and North Korea launched a missile over Japan, the day before the conference or the conversation started. And it really, to me, really hit home that this is the geopolitics of this is very real, particularly in that part of the world. Can you sort of like step back for a moment and take us through sort of how did we get here, and what do we need to know sort of about the overall threat?
Yeah, I think what state is doing in the public-private partnership is an important approach to this problem, a very important one. Understanding that problem, we've put a lot of resources into this as well. It is an element of a regime that is bucking the trend. This is not the type of regime that is trying one thing and using different ways to do that one thing. There's a learning process that's going on. And so how we got here is really a function of the North Korean regime looking at different revenue streams. The biggest one in recent times that was the main funder of the WMD programs was the coal trade, particularly with China. And this was at a time in the second half of the 2000s, the two phases really. The first phase of revenue generation, where North Korea was selling coal to China during a period in the second of the 2000s when it was world commodity peak price for coal. And even in instances where different Chinese customers underpaid the North Koreans, it was a sustainable and growing revenue stream for the regime. And so that's an important element of the puzzle. Stage two is an interesting research puzzle in the sense that during the COVID period, where since January of 2020, the North Korean regime sealed its own borders, the revenue generation from these other sources dried up. And it really was the growth in a very spectacular fashion of cyber operations with the money applications, the IT workers and overseas revenue from that, and then the crypto theft. So in a nutshell, our idea, this is the part of the expansion of the WMD and the resources that it needs being funneled from a revenue stream that has grown through a different functional approach. It's no longer the coal aspect and extracting minerals from the ground, but leveraging the globalized financial marketplace. And so the scale of it is quite considerable.
I think it's really extraordinary framing. And Nick, I would love to kind of get your take on this. It's almost like the story of your career from what I can at least put together, right? We think about what are the revenue streams and what are the investigations. They were around coal, counterfeit cigarettes, right? and now and then eventually Bitcoin, and now sort of this crypto ecosystem more broadly. Maybe speak a little bit to that in terms of the criminal activity that you've been tracking over time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, my own personal journey into crypto, right, was kind of kicking and screaming. I worked very much on the traditional trade-based money laundering stuff, right, which was the beating heart and soul of the North Korean financial system just a few years ago. But really, yeah, the COVID situation and then post 2016 ramp up of U.S. sanctions, like with the passage of NXPIA and CATSA, that just radically changed that environment, right? It was no longer a situation, right, where North Korea could make enough money from its traditional revenue sources. But yeah, working on these investigations, I'm struck by how tight this all still is. Like if you look at the recent case just a couple of weeks ago, DOJ and OFAC sanctioned a North Korean bank representative. It was KKBC and FTB, and these are the same people, right, who were in the middle of all of those older traditional trade-based money laundering cases that we worked on 10 years ago. So that's kind of the key thing about North Korea, is that it is a small target. It's not like China, it's not like Russia, it's not even like Iran. There's just a couple of thousand people really that are worth tracking and knowing, and they stay the same, even though the specific source may change. The actual methods may change. The people remain the same. And so for us, working these cases then and now, it's really just about tracking those people, tracking that activity, and then analyzing it and figuring out ways to disrupt it.
Moving you a little bit into the crypto space, kicking and screaming here. Would you just describe the sort of what's been going on in sort of that crypto ecosystem? I thought Jung did a good job of sort of laying out what we've been seeing. I think our numbers at TRM are probably much higher than what the U.S. government is reporting, at least for 2022. And it's really it's become a pretty extraordinary threat in large part of their proliferation program. Would you just maybe describe what we've seen over the last couple of years from North Korea in the crypto space?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really a story of evolution, right? As the U.S. government, as our allies have gotten better about trying to disrupt what their operations, right, of trying to stop or create more friction, right, they have evolved and gotten more effective. And so what we see, very much, I think the pattern set last year, especially with Ronin and the Harmony bridge hacks, is the enormous scale, obviously, right? These are enormous amounts of money. When you looked at the coal trade, right, you were talking about hundreds of millions of dollars a year. They can make that much money, pure profit, right? There's no work, there's no digging, there's no mining. They can make that much money in a couple of days with a handful of people. And so the particulars of it, right? We see like really aggressive laundering, much more aggressive, I think, than from anybody else in this space. Nobody else can afford to act the way the North Koreans do, because they're essentially immune to most forms of disruption and pressure.
Jung, building on maybe some of your earlier comments a little bit in terms of the way state operates in this space, it's kind of the international engagement piece. Maybe describe those efforts a little bit. And obviously, whenever you discuss sort of North Korea and money laundering, it's hard not to have China as sort of a part of that conversation. Maybe talk a little bit about efforts around, potentially around engaging China in this battle.
Heads up to, I think it's for us, it's really important that we share information and to show that we are delivering for the American people and for this community. And, in this particular context, Ari, later today or June 1st, we plan to release a cybersecurity advisory with the FBI, the National Security Agency, and the Republic of Korea government on the DPRK's malicious cyber hacking group, Kim Suk-hee. This is a group that uses social engineering practices to enable computer network exploitation globally against individuals employed by research centers and think tanks. I'm sure many of you are actually listening to us right now. This is for you, as well as academic institutions and news media agencies. This advisory was the culmination of months of coordination between U.S. and Korean government agencies who collaborated to ensure the most up-to-date information could be shared with the public on this threat. So So heads up that that's coming down the line today, June 1st. State, obviously, so there's that part of my job, but it's also, industry and making sure that our communities that are working on this issue are safe and are aware of what's going on and the threats and how they can get help. But we also, another part of my job is that international engagement. We work very closely with the Republic of Korea and Japan on DPRK related sanctions and DPRK related issues across the board. You might have seen that there have been a lot of bilateral and trilateral meetings from the president to the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense onward on these issues. For example, last week, Treasury imposed 4 sanctions last week on 4 DPRK entities and 1 individual involved in revenue generation and malicious cyber activities for the DPRK. And that was carried out in coordination with the Republic of Korea, which concurrently imposed sanctions against overseas DPRK IT workers. We regularly hold diplomatic and public engagements internationally to share information on DPRK's malicious cyber activities. Our department provides capacity building assistance worldwide to governments and to private institutions on countering the broad range of DPRK sanctions, evasion, and revenue generation activities. That includes cybersecurity, counterproliferation finance, maritime sanctions implementation, and other lines of effort that are responsive to ever evolving DPRK sanctions evasion tactics that John has so ably laid out. On China, China is a big part of this cyber and crypto threat because a lot of the activity is taking place in China and Russia. So those are the 2 elephants in the room. We engage or try to engage with the PRC interlocutors as much as we can, because we think this is not just in our interest, but it also in China's and Russia's interest to do something to do something positive and proactive with us or by themselves on the DPRK cyber activities, the overseas workers, and the malicious cyber activities. I think the PRC and Russia absolutely can and should do more on these issues, but also on sanctions implementation more broadly. The more that DPRK thinks that they're being shielded by Beijing and Moscow, the more emboldened they will be to continue these malicious activities and to develop their very dangerous and unlawful WMD and ballistic missile programs.
Really helpful. And John, I'm going to ask you to build off of that. Exactly where we left off there, sanctions and really sanctions effectiveness. You've written a lot about sort of the impact of sanctions potentially on DPRK activities. And obviously sanctions has become sort of the tip of the spear when it comes to our foreign policy vis-a-vis DPRK. Maybe talk a little bit about what you've your work in this space and maybe some conclusions you've drawn on sort of impact effectiveness of sanctions.
Building on what Jung has mentioned there, the partnership with industry is so crucial. And the way that I would frame it in response to your question there is if you look at it, there'll always be sanctions evasion, sanctions adaptation. It's an iterative game. So that's something we have to expect. Our job is to see how they're evolving to better understand the problems that are created, and in defining those problems, diagnosis, looking at what we can do about it. The piece of the equation that I would add to this, the subset of industry. If we go to the marketplace, and Nick mentioned this as well, when it comes to the crypto bridges with Ronin and with Harmony, there's a war of friction going on. So in the private sector, with the venture capital firms, with the startups, the gaming companies, the name of the game is to reduce friction to increase the user experience. It's a competitive landscape. They know what they're doing. It's a trade-off. And in order to win those users, to have those gaming site revenues and whatnot, this constant reduction of the friction. On the other side of the ledger, you have the US government and Treasury spearheading this in close coordination with state. You have the increasing focus on going after mixers. And that's about increasing friction specifically for North Korean cyber criminals. So this is the iterative game and the current phase that we're in right now. The two things to highlight, number one, there is an element of moral hazard. VCs, many of them know what's going on. But in order to reach targets for exit and return on investment and so forth, out of their portfolio companies, if some of them are the subject of attacks, hacks, and cyber theft, there's a movement to essentially dissolve and move away from that entity and then go to another startup or start another company. So less use of cybersecurity as a means of defense. That apart is what we're trying to address from a marketplace perspective. How do you incentivize these players to view this as good business, in addition to some important legislation, regulation that we need to add to it? The second thing I mentioned very quickly also is when you look at it, spear phishing tends to, and it's not a surprise for us, but it is still remarkable that spear phishing is the common entry point for malware. And here we have to look at what are different government, what are some other private sector perspectives. But I do think we have an opportunity to unleash entrepreneurialism. So for those startups who see this as a business opportunity, how do you address now increasingly sophisticated social spear phishing, tapping into users' anxiety? Click on this, here's the latest budget number, here are the reductions and the next headcount reductions that we're doing, review for your staff, things like that. But I do think there is another element in addition to the important activities in engaging between public sector and industry, the subset looking very closely what's happening with the VC and the startup space.
John, just to follow up real quickly on that last point, obviously this group is into very, very into the weeds, but would you just sort of lay out very quickly sort of the anatomy of a cyber attack, sort of in terms of North Korea, right? You started talking about spear phishing a little bit because really it's interesting. I mean, There is oftentimes Nick and I will see a hack or another attack and say, like, bam, this is North Korea. This has that sort of fingerprint. Would you sort of walk us through a little bit of the cyber element there?
Yeah, let me give you the case of what happened with the Ronin network. So the Ronin network is the crypto bridge on-ramp to the Axie Infinity gaming site. It's a pay-to-play. You actually make money eventually by playing on this site. And so here, North Korean cyber criminals targeted an engineer who was working at the Ronin network, overseeing the Ronin network, deployed malware and essentially created the gateways for the cyber criminals to go then into the crypto bridge and essentially steal the crypto. Crypto bridge is designed to convert one type of cryptocurrency into another. And again, because of this reduction of security in order to increase the user experience, the safety components of this is on purpose reduced. So we saw a very large heist in this instance, but that tends to be a pattern that's repeated. And amazingly, not much variation on that theme. And so the spear phishing angle of it becomes the gateway. And this is, I think, a priority in terms of how do we address this because it's recurring.
No, really, really, really helpful. And we talk about these attacks. It is always this sort of social engineering piece when it comes to North Korea. Obviously, a mix of other tactics, but that seems to be a hallmark. Nick, it seems there's a question in the chat, but I think this is sort of a broader question of how do we stop this? And it seems to me that sort of simplifying it to the extent possible, it's do exactly what John is talking about, and that is hardened cyber defenses, whether it's in that DeFi ecosystem, bridges, protocols. But then there's this other thing that I think that you're most focused on at TRM, and that is adding friction to the laundering process. Would you sort of build off that? So an attack happens, right? Maybe talk a little bit about that laundering process and what are things that can be done to add friction to it.
Yeah, well, I mean, first, right, North Korea has gotten very, very lucky successively, right, in that the initial phase of major crypto heists, stuff, like the Gate hack, the KuCoin hack, these were targeting centralized exchanges. But they were very early in their existence, right? And they didn't have rigorous security processes in place yet. And we really don't see that much anymore, right? Crypto businesses, traditional centralized exchanges have become much more security conscious. And so that target space has diminished year on year. I mean, there were only a handful of crypto exchange hacks in the last couple of years versus, prior years when there were many. But where North Korea got lucky, right, is you had the rise of DeFi in the last couple of years. And these are, extremely often decentralized projects with people all over the world, often anonymous, right, working together, not even knowing each other's real names. They're not exactly conducive to rigorous security. But even that space, right, we've seen kind of a professionalization and normalization. And I suspect that, attack surface is getting smaller and smaller, which might go into, why we see so many fewer hacks, even just in the last few months. targeting those. So that target space is getting smaller. Maybe there will be another, explosion of inaction and a new attack space will open up for the North Koreans. But what they do is very simple, right? What John's talking about. They engineer, they send a document to somebody that they try to get to open, and it just takes a little bit of awareness, to avoid that. So whether or not those old tricks will keep on working, I don't know. On the second part of the question, right, about how to increase friction, like even just maybe a year ago, I guess I felt a little less hopeful than I do now. But watching what happened, after the Ronin hack, after the Harmony hack, you have both government and industry doing a lot, right? I mean, taking back tens of millions of dollars from both of those hacks through asset freezes, right? When they convert the stolen money into centralized tokens like USDT and USDC. So that process, right, that teamwork, that interagency collaboration and intra-government and private sector cooperation has gotten amazingly more effective. It's not getting back everything, but it's making it much, much harder for the North Koreans to cash out. A few years ago, they could move tens of millions of dollars a day and nobody was able to do anything about it. That's not true anymore.
You, just building off that a little bit, and I think you started to get into this there, and it goes to a question in the chat. You talked, I think a few minutes ago, about sort of this idea of immunity, where it's just, there are no real repercussions to cyber criminals in North Korea for their activity. Talk a little bit about why, why is that, right? From a prosecution standpoint to investigation standpoint, but then also maybe talk a little bit about it in the money laundering context, right? Like they do different things than other cyber criminals because of that, not having that fear.
Sure. I think with that process, as Nick was mentioning, there is increasing cooperation, and there's some very important success cases in terms of tracking and then seizing, basically. One point I would mention, though, for the viewers who are relatively new, and this is a part of our learning experience as well, we have to keep in mind when North Korean cyber criminals stole from the Ronin network, it was approximately $600 million. That was the headline. But the caveat is that was cryptocurrency equivalent. They have to convert that into fiat. And even before Treasury's measures, using mixers is a big part of the expense if you think of North Korea Incorporated and the virtual business there. And so already it's a massive cost in the relative scheme. With respect to the focus on mixers now, there's an interesting dynamic happening because using mixers has become more expensive if you think about taking some of the big mixers outside of the marketplace. So it'll be interesting to track innovation in terms of how other players come in the subset of the mixer sub-marketplace, as it were. The other point I quickly mentioned here also is when it comes to the whole laundering of those funds, they're interesting innovations in terms of how to use that crypto. One of the things that we've been investigating is that, in the case of South Korea and a very vibrant, very commonly used virtual asset marketplace, crypto is used as collateral. And if it's used as collateral, the opportunity to do things off-chain becomes a function of financial creativity. We're trying to track that to see what opportunities potentially could there be on offer here, because cryptocurrency is in high demand in South Korea. Capital controls means that there's a premium on cryptocurrency there as well. So how this all ties in is a part of evolving research and things that we're looking at. But going to your question, and I think Nick's back online, I think this is an area where the different researchers and what they're doing, we need to approach it from the different angles. And this is a part about understanding this latest innovation.
Really awesome. Nick, my question to you was sort of like very much honestly, what John, I think, answered more broadly, but it's really sort of tactical, right? Why aren't North Korea cyber criminals concerned about arrest and then or disruption, and then what changes about the laundering process because of that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think imagine you are a Chinese or a Russian cyber criminal, right? You don't work for the state, right? You're maybe state sponsored. They may know who you are. They may help you, but you don't work for the government. And you're trying to get rich, right? The whole point of stealing hundreds of millions of dollars is to be personally rich. And what's a rich Russian or a rich Chinese going to do? He's going to go live in a nice place, right? And so that means that the United States or, friendly Western powers, right? They will be able to get them. Right? They can arrest, extradite, whatever, when they're traveling, when they transit. But North Koreans, they're not doing that. they are, officers of the state. They are in Pyongyang, using remote VPNs to do all the work that they're doing. For them, success is bigger money. Maybe they lose a little bit along the way when they launder it, but they're not ever going to be worried about an arrest or extradition. In the history of the U.S. government, we've only extradited one North Korean, and that was from Malaysia. We arrested one more, but he was under false documentation. That's just, not a lot of space, right? There's not a lot of chance they're going to get caught.
Really helpful. And just real quickly, putting a point on that, how does that change the way they operate in the sort of crypto laundering process?
Yeah, so they take risks that nobody else will, right? They move. Essentially, the North Koreans' attitude is not one of ensuring anonymity forever, right? Which a normal cyber criminal, he's trying to make sure that nobody ever figures out who he is. The North Koreans are just trying to buy 30 minutes to get to that off ramp and move the funds as quickly as they can. So for them, they don't care if we figure out that it was them, 3 days later. They care about right now.
Terrific. Jung, building off of all of this, I feel like all three of you have sort of gotten to the heart of North Korea has built a pretty extraordinary cyber capability, unparalleled really in the world, developing this expertise. How from putting your sort of intelligence officer hat on, in fact, you wrote a book on Kim Jong-un. Would you talk a little bit? How did we get here? How have they been able to pivot from coal and other types of value to this cyberspace? What feels like so seamlessly?
How we got here is not exactly here. In that how we got here started maybe in 2014 with the Sony hack by the DPRK. And I was at the National Intelligence Council at the time. And again, I don't know, Nick, Ari, you remember working on that issue, but that was the first big DPRK directed against private industry that scared the bejesus out of people who worked at Sony. That the DPRK denied that it did it. But we came together as an interagency, I think in record time in diagnosing and identifying the DPRK and releasing that information as quickly as we had done the assessments. In 2014, Kim Jong-un was, 2 years into his rule as the leader of DPRK. And I think, from my perspective, when I look at the arc of his leadership, it's very much youthful, modern, failing, but adjusting, improving and advancing, right? So it's not all this, straight up advancements, but that I think Kim's his characteristic or his personality characteristic, in my mind, fits a lot with this whole the way this crypto and cyberspace is so much evolved so quickly, and he's also able to adjust and evolve as quickly as the industry. That makes it very important for us to have prophylactics in place when we can. Right, we're not going to be able to catch every single spear phishing event. But in this space, I will take care of the ballistic missile programs and the nuclear weapons, and we'll do that as a whole of government. But in the cyber and crypto space, it reminds me a lot of COVID, right? You have prophylactics, you put on masks, you get vaccinated, but it has to be a team sport. And we, as my part in our government is that we will have the information that we will collect and assess and disseminate. But we also need help from the public. We need help from private industry, and our advisory later today on June 1st will also be a part of making sure that we have those channels of communication between the United States government and you all out there, as well as industry, to make sure that we can all kind of try to shield ourselves from the worst of these effects. This is a team sport. It's going to be an ongoing. It's a process. It's not going to be a destination, given the metastasis in the DPRK's tactics and their activities. So this is a growth industry for us, and something that we're ready to meet head on.
My favorite moments on TRM Talks is when other guests are nodding as someone is talking, because I know they want to jump in. And I feel like, Nick, you worked every one of these cases that was just mentioned. John, I feel like you have this really great macro view of all this. John, what anything to add to all of that?
I think those are super important points, and absolutely, it's a process. And with this, I think Jung has a great read on Kim Jong-un in that perspective. As someone who is essentially running a family business, he's exhibiting the traits and the practices of people in this crypto space on the revenue generation side. And so with that, I would just add the information part that Jung is talking about is critical, because with that information out there, and individuals who are on the front lines of this, either transacting in a similar way or, in some cases, quiet victims of North Korean hacks as well, this kind of information is critical in the sense of raising the level of our understanding to this. And increasingly, I do think there's an opportunity to have interactions with some of these quiet victims and what they're experiencing as well, because we can learn more about different types of techniques as this evolution goes on from the North Korean cyber criminal piece of it. The other element I would also add here is, if you look at the types of margins of this business, the margins are very much in a services type of dynamic. It is an evolution process, but if you compare it to the cold trade, extremely resource intensive, labor, you're taking a lot of different actors along the way. This is a part of North Korea not designing this, but being a beneficiary of this period where the world went on and did internet commerce. And so the number of targets available to North Korean cyber criminals has increased dramatically. And I think that's a part of how we're looking at it in the marketplace and things that we need to understand better on that dynamic.
Nick, I'm going to jump to you in a second, but for John or John, there's a question in the chat about how much of this behavior, and when I say behavior, I'm going to assume sort of this cyber activity in particular, sort of Lazarus Group-esque activity, is a function of Kim and what he's built as sort of a young leader, Jung, to your point, or is there now a systems in place where this is part of the systemic, this is part of the culture, these sort of cyber activities or cyber group?
I think it's systemic. And it's not something that's going to go away. These tech workers and these jobs are highly sought after. They're prized. They're they have coveted. They're coveted positions. They get goodies out of being such valuable revenue generators. As well as workers. So I think it's baked into the system. So I don't think it's necessarily just Kim, but it's also a necessity, right? We are all potential products for the DPRK for cyber generate or malicious cyber generating activities. Back before all the sanctions, turn back the clock, 20 years ago, the DPRK actually had, maybe 10 trading partners. Korea, Japan, India, parts of Southeast Asia. These were legit trading partners. But as they developed their nuclear weapons program, and as a result of sanctions, their economic activity and their trade activity has puckered up into, you guessed it, China, which has over 95%, and this is before COVID, 95% of North Korea's trade, and the DPRK is absolutely dependent on trade with with China. But with cyber, I would argue that kind of dependency is greatly reduced, right? Because we are all potential products of DPRK's malicious cyber activity. So this is not just about the DPRK targeting the United States or Korea or Japan, but also countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, South and Central Asia, the Middle East, you name it. Everyone's a target.
Terrific. Nick, I just want to pull one sort of piece out that we've talked a little bit about today and just want you to sort of pull the thread a little bit on it. We talked a lot about hacks. I feel like we have sort of a decent sense of sort of what that looks like. This IT worker issue, though, would you sort of just explain to the audience a little bit about what we're talking about when we're talking specifically sort of on this IT worker threat?
Yeah. So this actually kind of goes back, Jung talked about 2014 and the Sony hack, right? That's kind of the watershed, right? Where the North Koreans realize how much money there really is out there to steal. But before that, like the genesis of this whole industry, right? The idea that North Korea is an advanced technical power when it comes to cyber, right, is kind of counterintuitive. But it was very much like the genesis of this was the early 2000s and the building of entities like the Korea Computer Center, which were services oriented, right? I mean, they were trying to market themselves as legitimate, software contractors to come in and build solutions for people anywhere in the world for their software problems. So that's really the origin of this whole industry in North Korea, and it still continues. I mean, it's extremely lucrative. As anybody in the tech industry knows, you can make quite a bit of money remotely providing software services, right? Development services. And the North Koreans know that. So there's a lot of sites out there that, Freelancer and Upwork that are designed and oriented towards bringing in, freelance workers to do this kind of work. And it's very lucrative. You can make $20,000 a month if you're capable and skilled. And plenty of North Korean developers are capable and skilled. The second half of this, right, is then they're inside organizations. They're developing, tools and software for them, which gives them incredible access and the opportunity, right, to perpetrate additional criminal thefts, which they do.
Terrific. Yeah, Jung mentioned the sanctions last week from OFAC, which had an element of the sort of IT worker issue in that 4 cryptocurrency addresses were also added to the OFAC list because funds were sent. Funds went into those addresses associated with sort of salaries and sending, transferring funds here. If we look at in our handouts tab, there's a TRM summary of those sanctions that folks can take a look at. As we sort of go around the horn and wrap things up a little bit, John, I'm going to start with you here. You spent a lot of time on this issue. What are we not talking about? What is sort of a threat from North Korea? Obviously, we're focused on the crypto hack today, cyber, but sort of what aren't we talking about as much that maybe we should be?
I would say, and Jung alluded to this as well, this is not a problem specific to the United States or South Korea. I would add the dimension here, the international flavor of it is a lot of the targets and victims are small businesses. And if you look at the quantity, like the idea of how many of them potentially could be there, although the ransomware or the theft is of a smaller volume, just the sheer quantity of it, I think, is an area that we have to look into more detail. That's something that we're looking at as the next part of the research agenda. And this is a space where you don't need that many cyber operators, cyber criminals to conduct these type of campaigns. And so this is the element that if you look at the scale at which they operate, and it's still a relatively small group, this is a part that is troubling. And we need definitely to look into this in more detail. Number one, the techniques that they're using to do that. And then the second part is these are businesses, once they've been hacked, they keep on operating and they don't reveal that they've been hacked. This is something that for them, if it's revealed in their local communities online, they go out of business. And these, again, are small entities. So this is an area that I think is a priority that we hopefully as a research community can spend more time in terms of gathering more information about this ongoing evolution of the North Korean cyber criminals.
Really, really helpful, and goes right to Jung's point about the importance of those public-private conversations, so people are comfortable going to their regulator or to their government and saying, hey, this is something that that we're dealing with. Nick, you alluded to, we did a report that we put out last week at TRM that said basically hacks are down 70% from this time last year. Obviously, 2022 was a record-setting year for hacks. We saw about 3.7 billion in total. Some, over $1 billion of that attributed to North Korea. Obviously some of it could just be luck and happenstance in terms of where we are, but you alluded to some actual reasons why we may be there. I mean, Is this a trend? Something we should anticipate continuing, or sort of are we likely to are we one Ronin hack away from sort of being back in 2022?
Yeah, no, I don't even pretend to know, what the future is. It's probably just a function, I think, a big part of it, of the general cool down in the crypto market, right? I mean, we are definitely in another winter right now. So there's a lot less money sloshing around out there to be taken. But, I think looking forward, what John and Jung were alluding to is something I worry about a lot, which is, even now, right, in crypto, most of this is still kind of in the play money realm. There's not a lot of actual practical uses of crypto in industry for trade or for individual purposes and economic activity. When we cross that bridge and we all become targets for the North Koreans, that's essentially their absolute advantage in this, right? Is they can industrialize this. This is something that they can do on a scale that nobody else can. And so I worry a great deal about that. How will we secure possibly, ordinary individual Americans and South Koreans from targeted hacks? I don't know. Hopefully people smarter than me will figure out the answers to that. But why would North Korea stop too, right? I think that's the other key question here. And the other panelists were talking about this. North Korea is a really weird place. It is essentially a feudalist country, right? We talk about communist, Stalinist, whatever. I mean, it is feudalist, right? There's no tax structure. There's no governmental revenue. It's everybody out for themselves. Every one of these government ministries has its own little trade entity, has its own little piece of the pie. And this, right, is the intelligence services. They run the hacking. This is the golden goose for them. They have no reason to ever walk away from this until we can change that dynamic for them somehow.
Jung, I'm gonna finish up with you here. You can drop the mic on all of this. Feel free to build on sort of what's been said, but really my question for you is sort of, as we look forward, right, as the U.S. government, but working with foreign partners. Thank you. I love the announcement of the advisory. There's obviously a very similar one a few months ago on this IT worker issue, and then one on hacks even before that. So pushing out information to industry has been really so critical in this process. But I think John had some great suggestions on ways to work with industry on the hack issue, particularly in DeFi. But what as you look ahead, sort of like, what does the road ahead look like in terms of DPRK and the way you and the interagency are thinking about the issue?
I think Nick and John have already laid out that this is going to be an ongoing issue and a growing problem. I think, I don't make a habit of making predictions about what DPRK is going to do, but there potentially might be border softening by the DPRK in the coming weeks, months. And that means that more people can come out and do lots of illicit activities or activities that are banned by UNSCR's UN Security Council resolutions. And given that the DPRK would be coming out of over 3 years of self-imposed lockdown, that it's going to be a necessity for the regime to press the accelerator on revenue generation. We just saw a failed claimed military reconnaissance spy satellite by the DPRK. The regime has threatened other activities, including a potentially a normal range intercontinental ballistic missile test, as well as their aspirations for other dangerous weapon systems. So this is not just to tie this all up. It's an industry problem. It is what is the future of crypto and cyber and security problem, but it's also a serious national security, global security issue, which makes it very important that we continue on with this public-private relationship and for us to play a leading role in supporting the American people, but also other foreign governments to protect themselves against this growing and serious threat.
Really appreciate it, and great way to wrap this up. Look, I think that when we look out there at this, it is obviously a huge national security issue, but really also if you're someone, I think like us, like me, really believes in the promise of the crypto ecosystem, right? it is the greatest threat to that ecosystem. When you can steal $1 billion, to fund weapons proliferation, it is a great threat, across the world. Really appreciate you guys working on this issue, and thank you so much for joining TRM Talks today for a really, really great conversation. For everyone out there, please subscribe to our weekly roundup that has this type of content every single week in there. Subscribe to get notified about TRM Talks, and thank you for working with us to build a safer financial system. Have a great day, everybody.